cross. You're only good with a wrench. Don't dream of climbing a cockpit." Co-workers laughed, dismissing Elena as a nameless mechanic who'd never touched the skies. But when the emergency siren blared, an F-22 spiraled out of control and no one could save it. The commander called a name unheard for 12 years. Valkyrie. And before the stunned base, the woman they mocked stepped forward, not an engineer, but a resurrected Top Gun legend. Elena stood there, her hands still smudged with grease from the morning's work, her plain gray jumpsuit blending into the hangar's shadows. She wasn't the kind of person who caught your eye. No makeup, no jewelry, her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun that looked more practical than pretty. But there was something about her, maybe the way her shoulders stayed square or how her eyes didn't flinch when the laughter started. She was 34, but the years had carved a quiet strength into her face, the kind you only notice if you're really looking. And nobody in that hangar was looking. Not really. They saw a mechanic, someone who belonged under a jet, not in one. The air was thick with the smell of oil and metal, and the crew's voices echoed off the high ceilings, sharp and careless, like they were tossing stones at her just to see if she'd break. She didn't. Not when Jake, a wiry guy with a permanent smirk and a chip on his shoulder, leaned against a toolbox and said, "Hey, cross stick to bolts. You're not cut out for anything else." Not when Sarah, the team's self-appointed queen bee, with her perfect ponytail and designer sunglasses, added, "Yeah, you look like you're here to clean the place, not fix it." The others chuckled a low rumble that spread like wildfire. Elena's fingers tightened around the wrench in her hand, but she didn't look up. She just kept working her movements steady, deliberate, like she was pouring all her focus into the machine in front of her. The crew took it as surrender, but it wasn't. It was control. She'd learned that a long time ago. Let them talk. Let them think they've won. Words don't change who you are. As Elena adjusted a pressure valve, a memory flickered in the way her hand paused just for a second over the jet's sleek surface. Years ago, she'd sat in a cockpit just like this one. The vibration of the engines humming through her bones, the sky stretching out endless and wild. A photo tucked in her locker faded, and creased showed her younger grinning, in a flight suit, her helmet under her arm, standing next to a jet with Valkyrie painted on the side. She didn't look at it anymore, but its presence lingered heavy as the wrench in her hand. The crew didn't know. They didn't see the way her fingers traced the valve, like it was an old friend, or how her eyes flicked to the sky beyond the hangar doors, just for a moment before she bent back to her work. The hangar was buzzing that morning, everyone moving fast to prep for a routine training flight. Jets gleamed under the fluorescent lights, their sleek bodies lined up like soldiers waiting for orders. Elena was checking a fuel line, her hands moving with a precision that came from years of practice. She didn't talk much, didn't join in the banter or the gossip. That's what made her an easy target. People like Jake and Sarah, they thrived on picking at anyone who didn't fit their mold. And Elena, she didn't fit. Her jumpsuit was standard issue, faded from too many washes. Her boots were scuffed, no brand name to flaunt. To them, she was just background noise, someone who'd always be on the ground, never in the sky. They didn't know her past. Nobody did. Not here. A new voice joined the fray, cutting through the usual chatter. It was Derek, a lanky logistics clerk with a habit of name-dropping to seem important. He sauntered over clipboard in hand, his eyes scanning Elena like she was a line item to be crossed off. "Cross, you're wasting space here," he said, loud enough for the whole hangar to hear. "Why don't you stick to sweeping floors? Leave the real work to people who belong." A few laughs followed, but they were sharper now, edged with something meaner. Elena didn't pause, didn't even glance his way. She just slid a tool back into her belt, the motion so smooth it was almost invisible, and kept working. But her silence only fueled Derek's grin. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a mock whisper. "Seriously, who let you in here? You look like you wandered in from a junkyard." The crew roared, feeding off his bravado, oblivious to the way Elena's knuckles whitened around her tool. Before we go further, let's take a quick pause. If this story's hitting you, if you've ever felt like Elena judged for no good reason, grab your phone real quick. Give this video drop a comment below, maybe share a moment when you were underestimated, and hit that subscribe button. It means the world to keep telling stories like this, stories that remind us who we really are. All right, let's get back to it. The laughter was still hanging in the air when the siren cut through sharp and relentless. It wasn't a drill. Everyone froze, tools clattering to the ground, heads snapping toward the control tower. Red lights flashed across the hangar, and the radio crackled to life. F-22, Shadow 1 loss of contact. Spiraling at 20,000 feet, heading towards civilian airspace. The voice was clipped, urgent. Backup pilot down. We need a replacement. Now, the words hit like a punch. A billion-dollar jet was out of control, and if it went down, it wouldn't just be metal, it'd be lives. Houses, schools, families. The whole base felt the weight of it. The air turning heavy like a storm was about to break. Jake was the first to speak, his smirk gone replaced by a nervous edge. Who's even available? All the pilots are either up or grounded. Sarah crossed her arms, her sunglasses pushed up on her head, now her eyes darting around like she was waiting for someone else to step up. The other mechanics shuffled, looking anywhere but at each other. Elena stayed still, her wrench resting on the jet's open panel. She didn't move, didn't speak, but her jaw tightened just enough for someone paying attention to notice. And someone was Commander Holt, a grizzled man with gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, stood in the doorway, his uniform crisp despite the chaos. He didn't say anything at first, just watched, his gaze lingering on Elena longer than it should have. Across the hangar, a maintenance log lay open on a workbench, forgotten in the chaos. Elena's name was scrawled on it, but next to it a faint pencil mark caught the light. A call sign half erased, barely legible: Valkyrie. Nobody noticed it, not yet, but it was there, a ghost from her past waiting to be seen. The crew was too busy arguing, their voices rising over the siren. No one's trained for this. Marcus set his hands on his hips, his voice loud to cover his panic. We're screwed. Elena's eyes flicked to the log, then away, her fingers brushing the wrench like it was grounding her. She didn't speak, but her posture shifted just enough to hint at something coiled, something ready. The crew didn't notice. They were too busy throwing out names each one shot down. Carter's on leave. Ramirez is sick. No one's checked out on the F-22 in months. The panic was spreading, voices overlapping, until Sarah turned to Elena, her voice dripping with scorn. What, you think you're gonna step up, Cross? You're not thinking of letting her fly, are you? The hangar erupted in laughter again, but it was sharper now, meaner, like they were daring her to try. Jake piled on, leaning forward, his voice loud enough to carry. Better to lose the jet than hand it to a mechanic. She'd crash it in 10 seconds flat. Another guy, a stocky tech named Marcus with a habit of talking over everyone, snorted. Yeah, she'd wreck it faster than my kid on a tricycle. The room was a wall of noise now, every word aimed at Elena, trying to push her down, keep her small. She didn't flinch. Her hands stayed steady, but her eyes lifted, locking onto Sarah's for just a second. You done? She asked, her voice low, calm, like she was asking about the weather. The words weren't loud, but they cut through the noise like a blade. Sarah blinked, her mouth half open like she'd expected a fight. Not that. The laughter faltered, a few people shifting uncomfortably, but no one backed down. Not yet. They were too caught up, too sure of themselves. Elena turned back to her work, her fingers moving again, tightening a bolt with a slow, deliberate twist. The gesture said more than any argument could. She wasn't here to prove anything to them. Outside, the sound of a car engine rumbled, faint but distinct, pulling Elena's gaze for a split second. It was a deep, throaty sound, like the old Mustang her wingman used to drive back when they'd race across the tarmac after a long day laughing until they couldn't breathe. The memory was gone as fast as it came, but her hand lingered on the bolt, her fingers still like she was holding on to something she couldn't name. The crew didn't see. It didn't know what that sound meant to her. They were too busy jeering, their voices a wall of noise. But Commander Holt was still watching, his eyes narrowing like he'd caught something nobody else had. Commander Holt stepped forward, his boots heavy on the concrete floor. The room quieted, not because he raised his voice, but because his presence demanded it. He was old school, the kind of officer who'd seen wars and lost friends, and when he looked at you, it felt like he was seeing through you. Cross, he said, his voice steady but cold, like he was weighing every syllable. We know you're not just an engineer. He dropped a folder onto the table, the thud echoing in the now silent hangar. The label was stamped Red Classified. He flipped it open, and there it was, her past laid bare. Top Gun class of 2011. Call sign Valkyrie. Missing for 12 years. The words hung in the air, heavy as the jet overhead. The crew's reaction was instant, a mix of gasps and muttered curses. Jake's face went slack, like someone had pulled the plug on his bravado. Sarah's sunglasses slipped from her head, clattering to the floor. Marcus just stared, his mouth moving like he was trying to form words but couldn't. Impossible. Sarah finally said, her voice shaking. She's the vanished legend. The whispers spread, people looking at Elena like she was a ghost who'd just stepped into the light. Elena didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the file or the stares. She just stood there, her hands still, her face unreadable. That person is gone, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but it carried a weight that made the room feel smaller. As the whispers died down, a new figure pushed through the crowd, Lieutenant Kara Wells, a pilot with a reputation for cutting down anyone who threatened her spotlight. She was tall, all sharp angles and polished confidence, her flight suit tailored to show off every curve. "Cowards who run aren't warriors anymore," she said, stepping into the circle, her eyes fixed on Elena. "Valkyrie is dead. Only Cross the mechanic remains." The words were meant to sting, and they did. A few people nodded, their doubt creeping back. Marcus found his voice again, muttering, "Don't let an old ghost ruin this mission." The air turned cold, the weight of their words pressing down on Elena, trying to bury her all over again. Elena's fingers brushed the edge of the classified folder, not opening it, just touching it like she was testing its reality. Her eyes stayed on Kara, steady, unyielding, but her lips pressed into a thin line, the only sign of the wound those words had reopened. 12 years ago, she'd walked away from a burning jet, her wingman's voice still echoing in her headset, his last words cut off by static. She'd carried that silence ever since, let it define her, let it push her into the shadows. But now, with the siren screaming and the folder staring up at her, that silence felt heavier than ever. She didn't speak, didn't defend herself. She just looked at Kara, her gaze like a wall, and said, "You sure about that?" Her voice was soft, but it landed like a hammer, silencing the room. Holt didn't let it go. He leaned closer, his eyes locked on hers. "If you don't return, thousands will die." The words weren't a request. They were an order, and they hit her like a physical blow. She didn't move, but her fingers twitched just once, like she was gripping something invisible. The crew was watching now, not laughing anymore, but waiting like they were holding their breath. The siren was still blaring, a reminder that time was slipping away, that a jet was falling, that lives were on the line. Elena's eyes flicked to the open hangar doors, where the sky was a clear, endless blue. For a moment, she looked like she was somewhere else, somewhere far away, where the air smelled of jet fuel and freedom. The moment broke when a young technician barely out of training piped up from the back. His name was Ethan, all nervous energy and desperate to fit in, his voice cracking as he spoke. "She's gonna choke up there," he said, glancing at his buddies for approval. "You can't just jump in a jet after years of nothing. She's not even cleared." A few nods followed, the doubt spreading again like a fire they couldn't let die. Elena's hand paused over her toolbox, her fingers brushing a small worn keychain, a tiny silver jet, a gift from her old squadron. She didn't look at it, but her thumb ran over its edges, a quiet anchor. The crew didn't see it, didn't know what it meant. They just kept talking, their voices piling on, trying to drown her out before she even started. She didn't answer Ethan. She just turned and walked toward the locker room, her steps even unhurried, like she'd made up her mind long before anyone else realized it. The crew parted for her, not because they wanted to, but because something in her presence made them. She didn't look back, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her hesitate. Inside the locker room, the air was cooler, quieter, the siren muffled by the thick walls. Elena stopped in front of a rusted locker, one nobody ever touched. She unzipped a dusty duffel bag, the kind that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Inside was her Top Gun flight suit, folded neatly, the name Valkyrie stitched in bold letters across the chest. Her fingers brushed over it, lingering on the fabric, and for a moment her shoulders softened, like she was remembering the weight of it on her body. As she pulled the flight suit on, the zipper's rasp echoed in the empty room, a sound that felt like a door unlocking. The fabric hugged her frame, familiar yet foreign after so long. She adjusted the straps, her movements slow, deliberate, like a ritual she'd almost forgotten. A faint scar on her wrist peeked out from under the cuff, a burn from that day 12 years ago, when the sky had turned against her. She didn't look at it, didn't need to. She just snapped the last buckle into place and reached for her helmet, its visor scratched but still gleaming. When she slid it on, the mechanic was gone. Valkyrie stood in her place, her eyes hard as steel, ready to face the sky again. She stepped back into the hangar, and the entire base froze. The flight suit fit her like it had never left the patches gleaming under the lights. The crew stared, their mouths half open, like they were seeing a myth come to life. The radio crackled again. F-22, Shadow 1 awaiting pilot. 10 minutes left. Elena didn't acknowledge the stares or the whispers. She walked straight to the jet, her boots echoing on the concrete, each step a declaration. The ladder was already in place and she climbed it without hesitation. Her movements smooth practice like she'd done it 1,000 times before. Because she had, but the jeers didn't stop. A young pilot, a cocky kid named Ryan with a buzz cut and a chip on his shoulder, stepped forward, his voice loud enough to carry over the engines. "If you fail, I'll drag you before court-martial myself." Another, an older guy named Tom, who'd been passed over for promotion too many times, sneered, 12 years gone. "You've lost your reflexes. You're gonna crash and burn." The doubt was thick, almost tangible, like they were all waiting for her to prove them right. Elena didn't respond. She just settled into the cockpit, her hands moving over the controls with a calm that silenced the room. The canopy lowered, and for a moment she was alone with the jet, the world outside fading away. Just before the canopy sealed, a maintenance worker named Liz, who'd always stayed quiet in the background, slipped a folded note under Elena's gear. It was simple, scrawled in hasty pen. "You got this, Valkyrie." Liz didn't wait for a response, just stepped back, her face half hidden in the crowd. Elena's fingers brushed the note, her eyes scanning the words, and for the first time that day, her lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close. She tucked the note into her pocket, her hand lingering there like it was a small piece of armor. The crew didn't see. It didn't know someone had her back. They were too busy doubting their voices, a low hum under the jet's roar. The engines roared to life, a deep guttural sound that shook the hangar. The radio crackled, Shadow 4 ready for orders. It was her voice, but it wasn't the quiet mechanic they knew. It was forged iron steady and sure, the voice of someone who'd flown through hell and come out the other side. Commander Holt froze his hand hovering over the radio like he hadn't expected to hear that voice again. The squadron of F-22s formed up on the tarmac, their engines screaming, and Elena's jet was at the lead. She didn't hesitate, didn't falter. She flew like she'd never left her hands moving with a precision that was almost inhuman, locking onto the failing signal of the rogue jet. In the sky, it was chaos. The F-22 Shadow 1 was spiraling, its systems fried, its pilot unresponsive. Elena's voice came over the radio, calm, controlled, guiding the other jets into position. "Flank left, hold steady. I'm going in." She maneuvered her jet closer, close enough to see the smoke trailing from the other plane's wing. The crew on the ground was silent now, watching the screens their earlier scorn replaced by something else, fear maybe, or awe. She locked onto the signal, sent a manual override, and guided the crippled jet toward a safe descent. The pilot's voice came through weak but alive. "Thanks, whoever you are." Elena didn't respond. She didn't need to. As she brought her jet back to the runway, the control tower erupted in cheers, but not everyone joined in. A group of officers stood off to the side, their faces tight with resentment. One of them, Major Grant, a man with a polished smile and a knack for climbing ranks through connections, leaned toward his colleague and muttered, "She got lucky. Doesn't mean she's one of us." His words were low, but they carried, and Elena's hand paused on the cockpit, release her fingers curling slightly. She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge him, but the way she tilted her head said she had heard every word. She stepped down from the jet, her boots hitting the tarmac with a quiet thud, and walked past them, her helmet under her arm, her eyes fixed straight ahead. When she landed, the base was a different place. The jet taxied to a stop, and the canopy opened, revealing Elena Valkyrie still in her flight suit, her helmet under her arm. The crew was there, but the laughter was gone. Jake wouldn't meet her eyes. Sarah's sunglasses were back on, but her hands were shaking. Marcus just stood there, his arms crossed like he was trying to hold on to his pride. But not everyone was ready to let it go. A senior officer, a guy named Colonel Vance, with a reputation for never backing down, muttered under his breath, "One save doesn't make her trustworthy." Another, a logistics officer named Claire, who'd always hated being outshined, whispered, "A deserter stays a deserter." The air was icy again, their words trying to pull her back down. In the quiet of the debriefing room later that day, Elena sat alone, her flight suit still on her hands folded on the table. A single light buzzed overhead, casting shadows across her face. A junior officer, a woman named Patel, who'd always kept her distance, hesitated at the door, then stepped inside. She didn't say much, just slid a cup of coffee across the table and nodded. "Heard what you did up there," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Good work." Elena's eyes flicked up, surprised, and she gave a small nod back, her fingers brushing the cup's handle. It wasn't much, but it was enough a crack in the wall the base had built around her. She took a sip, the warmth steadying her, and for a moment the room felt less empty. Elena didn't react to the lingering doubts. She just walked past them, her helmet swinging lightly in her hand, her steps even and unhurried. But something had shifted. The base was buzzing not with laughter now, but with whispers. Valkyrie, she's back. Did you see her fly? And then the truth started to come out, piece by piece. A declassified file hit the commander's desk later that day, its pages worn but damning. The accident 12 years ago, the one that had driven Elena into hiding, wasn't her fault. A technical failure covered up to protect the brass had killed her wingman. Elena's quick call had saved 4 other pilots, but she'd carried the blame to the guilt, the weight of it all for over a decade. As the file circulated, a young reporter from a local news outlet caught wind of it waiting outside the hangar with a camera crew. She was eager, her notepad filled with questions, but when she saw Elena, she hesitated, her pen hovering. Valkyrie, she stammered. People are saying you're a hero. What do you say to that? Elena stopped, her bag slung over her shoulder, and looked at the reporter, her eyes steady but tired. I just did my job, she said, her voice quiet but firm, and walked away before the camera could catch more. The reporter stood there scribbling furiously, her face lit with something like respect. The story was already spreading a spark that would soon become a fire. The news spread like wildfire. By evening, the base was silent, the kind of silence that comes when people realize they've been wrong. Commander Holt found her in the hangar alone, wiping down her tools like nothing had happened. He stood at attention, his salute sharp and deliberate. Welcome back, Valkyrie, he said, his voice thick with respect. Elena looked up, her eyes meeting his, and for the first time that day, she nodded just once. It wasn't triumph, it wasn't vindication. It was acknowledgement, like she was finally letting herself be seen. Later that evening, as Elena packed her tools, a maintenance worker named Sam, an older guy with hands rough from years in the hangar, approached her quietly. He'd never joined in the mocking, but he'd never spoken up either. Now he held out a small patch, the kind pilots sew onto their jackets, a silver wing worn but proud. Found this in storage, he said, his voice gruff. Thought it belonged to you. Elena took it, her fingers tracing the stitching, and for a moment her eyes softened, like she was seeing an old friend. She didn't say anything, just slipped the patch into her pocket, but Sam nodded like he understood and walked away. The next morning the headlines hit, Top Gun pilot, buried for 12 years, returned to save a generation. The story was everywhere online, on TV, in every corner of the base. Jake was let go quietly, his contract terminated for conduct unbecoming. Sarah's social media was flooded with screenshots of her comments, her sponsorships drying up overnight. Marcus lost his promotion, his name dropped from the shortlist. It wasn't revenge, it was just the truth, catching up, the scales balancing themselves. Elena didn't say a word about it. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any speech. As the base grappled with the news, a small crowd gathered near the tarmac, watching as Elena walked toward a waiting helicopter, her bag slung over her shoulder. They weren't cheering, but they weren't mocking. Either just watching, like they were seeing her for the first time. A young mechanic, barely 20, broke from the group and ran up, holding out a worn logbook. Can you sign this? He asked, his voice shaking. Elena paused, surprised, then took the pen and scrawled Valkyrie across the page. The kid grinned, clutching the book like it was treasure, and ran back to the crowd, who parted for him, their faces a mix of awe and shame. Later that day, a man walked into the hangar. He was tall, quiet, his suit understated but expensive, his presence enough to make the room still. Nobody needed to say his name. He was Elena's husband, a man whose influence reached higher than anyone in that hangar could imagine. He didn't speak, didn't glare, just stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Jake froze, his toolbox half-packed. Sarah looked away, her sunglasses no help now. Marcus muttered something and left his shoulder slumped. The room had changed, not because of him, but because of what his presence meant. Elena wasn't just a mechanic, wasn't just a pilot. She was someone who'd carried a legend in silence, and now the world knew. Elena didn't linger. She picked up her bag, slung it over her shoulder, and walked out, her husband at her side. The hangar doors were open, the sky beyond them, a deep, endless blue. She didn't look back, didn't need to. The truth was out there now, in the headlines, in the whispers, in the way people stepped aside as she passed. She'd carried the weight for 12 years, and now she was free. Not because she'd won, but because she'd never stopped being who she was. For everyone who's ever been judged, who's ever been told they don't belong, who's ever stood quiet while the world tried to make them small, Elena's story is for you. You weren't wrong. You weren't alone. Your truth is enough. It always was. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.